In December of 1872, a young British museum assistant named George Smith sat in a back room surrounded by broken clay tablets nobody else wanted to translate. He'd never been to university. He'd started as an apprentice engraver and taught himself cuneiform in his spare time, reading through crates of fragments other scholars had set aside as too damaged to bother with. One afternoon, working through a badly broken tablet from the ruins of Nineveh, he found a flood story. A boat, a bird sent out to look for land, a mountain where the vessel finally came to rest. He was, by every account from people who were there that day, so stunned that he leapt up and began tearing off his clothes in excitement. He had just become the first person in 2,500 years to read the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and one of the first people in the modern era to realize that the biblical flood account wasn't the only ancient flood account in the world. It might not even be the oldest one. That discovery kicked off more than a century of serious scholarship comparing Mesopotamian religious texts to the Hebrew Bible, and it's still one of the most well-documented areas in the study of the ancient Near East. Tonight we're going through what the Sumerians and their successors, the Akkadians and Babylonians, actually wrote about the realm of the gods. Real texts, translated by real scholars, sitting today in museums in London, Philadelphia, and Istanbul. And we're going to be careful the whole way through about 3 separate things that often get blurred together in videos like this. What the tablets actually say, what mainstream historians conclude from that, and what's pure speculation dressed up to sound like scholarship. Let's start with who we're talking about. The Sumerians emerged in southern Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago, and they left behind the oldest deciphered writing system on Earth. In their theology, the gods who ruled over them were called the Anunnaki. You'll often see this name translated online as those who from heaven to earth came, presented as if that's the accepted scholarly meaning. It isn't. That specific gloss comes from a fringe, non-academic interpretation popularized in the 20th century, not from Assyriology. The mainstream, dictionary-level translation renders Anunnaki closer to the princely offspring or the seed of Anu, Anu being the sky god at the head of the pantheon. It's a real word with a real, documented meaning, just not the dramatic one that gets repeated in ancient astronaut content. With that correction in place, let's go through what the actual texts describe. In Sumerian cosmology, the heavens were imagined in physical, spatial terms. A sky god named and ruling from the uppermost region, with other gods governing the air, the waters, and the earth beneath him. This is well documented, and it's a completely ordinary feature of ancient Near Eastern religious imagination generally, a layered, physically described cosmos, rather than an abstract, spiritual dimension, shows up across many polytheistic systems of the period, not uniquely in Sumer. The story of Edna, a legendary early king of Kish, describes him riding an eagle up toward the heavens to fetch a plant that would let his wife bear a child. And the poem genuinely does describe the land shrinking below him as he rises, a striking, evocative piece of ancient imaginative writing. It's worth appreciating as literature on its own terms. Reading it as an accurate description of a real high-altitude flight, rather than as the kind of vivid mythic imagery ancient poets across many cultures used for divine ascents, goes well beyond what the text itself or mainstream Assyriology supports. Sumerian temples were understood as the literal residence of a city's god, and this part is very well documented archaeologically and textually. Cult statues were fed, clothed, and cared for by priests as part of standard Mesopotamian religious practice. This is real, established history, not speculation. Enlil was worshipped at Nippur, Enki at Eridu, Inanna at Uruk. It's a genuinely different picture of divine presence than the transcendent, non-physical God described in Islamic theology, and that contrast is worth sitting with honestly rather than softening. The Sumerians were polytheists describing localized, physically present deities. Islamic belief in Allah as utterly transcendent, without physical location, form, or need. There is nothing like unto him. Surah Ash-Shura 42:11. Stands in direct and deliberate contrast to exactly this kind of ancient conception, not as a later refinement of it, but as a different claim entirely. Here's a good place for the first pause. If you want the tablet references for everything so far, the Edna epic, the Nippur temple records, they're linked in the description, and I'd encourage you to read the primary translations directly rather than taking any single video's word for it, mine included. 3. The Akkadian epic Atrahasis, one of the best-preserved Mesopotamian creation narratives, does describe the lesser gods, the Igigi, growing exhausted from labor and staging what reads very much like a strike against Enlil. This is a real and well-studied text, and it's a genuinely striking piece of ancient literature, a divine realm with hierarchy, labor, and open rebellion rather than static harmony. It's mythology, told by a polytheistic culture to explain their own social order by projecting it onto the gods, which is a common pattern across ancient religious literature. It isn't presented by mainstream scholarship as a historical record of an actual event in a real heaven, and nothing here should be read that way. For Atrahasis goes on to describe humanity being created specifically to take over that labor, formed from clay mixed with the blood of a slain rebel god, so the working gods could rest. This is accurately summarized. It's the plain content of the text. It's also worth being direct about what it is, the founding myth of a specific ancient polytheistic society, describing humanity's purpose in terms of servitude to multiple competing deities. That is a fundamentally different claim from what the Quran teaches about why human beings exist. The Quran states humanity and jinn were created to worship God. I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me. Surah 80 51:56. A purpose framed around devotion to one God, not conscripted labor for an exhausted workforce of many. These aren't two versions of the same idea softened over time. They're different foundational claims from different traditions, and it's worth naming that plainly rather than blurring them together. The Mesopotamian divine assembly, gods debating, voting, and shifting power between Anu, Enlil, and later Marduk of Babylon as that city's political power grew, is real and well documented, and it's a fascinating window into how Mesopotamian religion tracked the political history of the region. When Babylon rose to dominance, its scribes rewrote the cosmic hierarchy to put their city's god at the top, in a text called the Enuma Elish. The flood narrative's depiction of the gods panicking and weeping at the destructiveness of their own flood, and the account of two gods getting drunk and decreeing flawed humans into existence, are both accurately drawn from real tablets. Told plainly, this is a portrait of finite, limited, competing deities, which is exactly the kind of God Islamic theology explicitly and repeatedly rules out. The Quran describes Allah as without partner, without need, without limitation. Say, He is Allah, the One. He begets not, nor is He begotten, and there is none comparable to Him. Surah Al-Ikhlas, 112:1-4. The Sumerian pantheon isn't an earlier, rougher draft of that description. It's describing something categorically different. Many gods, not one, limited, not limitless. 6. Later Babylonian and broader ancient Near Eastern cosmology did describe multiple layered heavens, and ziggurats were genuinely understood as points of contact between the divine and human realms. The name Babylon does derive from Akkadian Babilu, gate of the god, and that etymology is well established. It's worth noting, because it sometimes surprises people, that the Quran also describes 7 heavens, Surah Al-Mulk, 67:3, among others. Comparative religion scholars have long noted that a layered cosmos was a common feature across many ancient Near Eastern cultures, Mesopotamian religion included. That shared cultural vocabulary for describing up and the divine realm doesn't mean the concepts are equivalent, though. Islamic theology doesn't present the 7 heavens as physical stone architecture built by God the way a ziggurat was built by human hands, and doesn't tie access to them to any earthly structure. The word is shared across the region's ancient languages far more than the underlying theology is. Second pause here. The full Atrahasis and Enuma Elish translations, and where exactly the Babylon name etymology comes from, are in the linked document if you want to check the primary sources directly. 7. The Epic of Gilgamesh's account of the hero's quest for a plant of immortality, losing it to a snake at the water's edge after finally retrieving it from the sea floor, is accurately described, and it remains one of the most powerful meditations on mortality in world literature. It's genuinely worth reading in full. Presented on its own terms, it's a story about a Bronze Age king's grief and his forced acceptance of death, not a lost chemistry manual. Reading it as literal evidence of a real biological immortality treatment goes past what the text or any mainstream Assyriologist claims for it. 8. The Sumerian paradise land Dilmun, described in the myth Enki and Ninhursag as a place without sickness, predation, or death, is real and well documented, and later Babylonian tradition does place the flood survivor, Utnapishtim in Akkadian, in a distant, blessed dwelling after the flood, sometimes associated with Dilmun by scholars, though the text itself is somewhat vague on the exact connection, and this is a point of ongoing academic discussion rather than settled fact. What's accurate and important here? In the Mesopotamian account, Utnapishtim's immortality is granted as a one-time, singular exception by divine counsel, not offered as a path open to anyone. It's genuinely worth comparing to the account of Nuh, peace be upon him, in the Quran, a prophet who obeys a divine command, builds a vessel, and preserves life through a flood, Surah Hud 11:36-48. The two accounts share real structural elements: a flood, a warned survivor, a vessel, a landing place. That resemblance is one of the best documented parallels in comparative ancient Near Eastern literature, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. So here's the honest version of the question the original framing of this topic likes to leave hanging. Does the resemblance mean later scripture borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian myth, softening it as it went? Or does it mean the Sumerians were literally recording contact with visiting beings, in the way some ancient astronaut writers claim? Mainstream historians overwhelmingly favor a version of the first explanation, that these were widely shared story elements circulating across a common ancient Near Eastern cultural and literary environment, developed and reshaped by different peoples over centuries. This is a well-supported, mainstream academic position, not fringe theory. The second explanation, gods as literal extraterrestrial visitors, has no support in mainstream archaeology or Assyriology and is not treated as a serious historical hypothesis by scholars in the field. It's speculative fiction built on top of real texts, and it's worth being able to say that plainly rather than presenting it as a live academic debate. There is a third way to look at this question, one the original framing leaves out entirely, and it's worth stating clearly because it's a real position held by Islamic scholars rather than a modern invention for this video. In Islamic understanding, prophets were sent to every nation throughout history. There was no nation but a warner had passed among them. Surah Fatir 35:24, including, by that account, to peoples of ancient Mesopotamia. From that perspective, a shared memory of a real flood and a real warned survivor could plausibly have circulated across the ancient Near East in different forms, some more accurately preserved than others, with the Quran presenting the account it holds to be the accurate one. That's a theological position, not a historical or archaeological claim I can verify for you, and I want to be clear it's presented here as exactly that, one way believers understand the relationship between these old stories, not a conclusion the tablets themselves prove. What the tablets do prove, without any speculation attached, is that the Sumerians and their successors built an extraordinarily detailed, internally consistent religious system around many gods, finite, competing, physically located, capable of fear and error. That's real, fascinating ancient history, worth studying on its own terms. It simply isn't a rough draft of monotheism. It's a different claim about the universe altogether, and the sharpest thing you can say about the distance between that world and the one described in the Quran isn't that one is a kinder, softened version of the other. It's that one describes many limited gods running a household, and the other describes one God, without partner or limit, who has no need of a household at all.